If you're new to MotoGP or if you've been watching it a while, you need to watch this video. There's 1,000,001 different things you feel like you have to know, and it can all get quite confusing. But in this video, I'm going to break down everything you need to know, and by the end of this video, you're going to be an absolute professional in the sport. So where do we start? Well, first I want to show you the bikes themselves. They're a pretty important part of MotoGP. But you can't simply walk into a showroom, buy a road bike, tweak it a little bit, and then race it in MotoGP. These machines instead are built from the ground up, and they're called prototypes. I'm going to go through how much they cost a little bit later on in this video, but every bike on the grid has to follow a certain number of regulations to keep the racing as close as possible. One of these regulations is the engine spec. Every team must build an engine that's a 4-stroke and naturally aspirated. Beyond that, in all honesty, teams are free to design the engine that they want. They can have a maximum engine size of 1000cc and a maximum bore stroke of 81mm, bore size being essentially the size of the piston that they can use. They're able to choose the engine configuration, which every team on the grid apart from Yamaha is now running a V4, with Yamaha instead running a traditional inline 4. There's no power limit or anything like that, they simply need to build the most powerful and fastest engine that they can. So we know the engine specs themselves, but there's a couple more regulations that they have to follow. For example, a team needs to specify an engine spec that they're going to use for the entire season before the season has even begun. Once they've declared that engine spec, they can't change it. Not only that, but both riders within the same team need to use the same engine spec for the whole season. And to make things even more interesting, they're only allowed 7 engines per rider per season. So there's a few technical challenges, not only to make them as fast as they possibly can, but also to make them reliable. MotoGP bikes do around 600 kilometers per weekend, which adds up to around 12,600 kilometers per season. What this means is they need to build an engine that will run at least 1/7 of that distance, which is around 1,800 kilometers. It's not quite that simple because different circuits have different engine demands, but that's quite complex and I'm not going to cover that in this video. So now we know the specs the engines are built to, but how do they get the power down on the track? Well, let's take a look at the tyres. Teams don't manufacture their own tyres. Instead, MotoGP has an official tyre supplier, which in this case is Michelin. Michelin supply tyres for every single team across every single race weekend over the season. They even know exactly which tyre was used by each rider at any given moment, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. But way before even the first race has begun, Michelin lets the teams know the different compounds they're going to be using for that season. That might sound a little bit strange, but it's going to make sense, trust me. Michelin designs a variety of different compounds to cope with different tracks over the course of the season, mainly due to the different weather conditions. Places like Malaysia and Thailand are going to be incredibly different weather-wise compared to the UK, and different tyre compounds are going to perform better, and by letting teams know early, they can plan accordingly. Each team can choose their tyre allocation for the race weekend. They've got a choice of 22 slick tyres in total, 10 fronts and 12 rears, and they can choose from the different compounds that Michelin provide before the race weekend itself. For the front tyres, riders can choose between a hard, a medium and a soft compound tyre, and they can have a maximum of 5 tyres from each of those compounds. Rear tyre selection has changed slightly over the last couple of years, and they can only choose from 2 compounds per race weekend. This will be a harder compound tyre and a softer compound tyre. But they're only allowed 5 of the harder compound and 7 of the soft. So you may be asking, what about if it's wet? Well, they have a separate allocation for wet tyres over the race weekend, and it consists of 6 front tyres and 7 rears. Now remember how I said Michelin knows exactly what tyre is used by each rider at any moment? Well, every single tyre has a unique serial number, and these tyres are assigned to a rider specifically. They're all picked at random from a batch by Michelin to make it as fair as possible, and once the tyres are assigned with a rider, they can't be shared in the team. This means at any one point, Michelin or the technical director can check any tyre at any time against any rider to make sure it's the correct one being used. Now, to give even more performance and to help with mechanical grip, MotoGP teams are leaning more and more towards winglets and different aero packages to give more aerodynamic grip. Now what this means is they're not having to rely completely on the mechanical grip of the tyre. There's quite a few complicated regulations around this, but the general gist is this. They can only add a certain number of aero parts to the bike, and they can also only protrude a certain amount to be deemed legal. And they're also not allowed to use any movable aero devices like DRS in F1. this can create some strange and often ugly looking bikes. They're also only allowed to make one aero package adjustment for the entire season. While aero can be freely designed, the electronics of the bike are all the same, and they're supplied directly by MotoGP. That includes the ECU and the IMU components. So we've gone through the bikes themselves as well as the tyres and all of the electronics. But what happens when riders have a crash? Have you ever wondered how riders are able to seemingly walk away from a huge crash with minimal damage? Well, it's thanks to their safety gear. Every single piece of safety equipment that riders used has to be homologated to a certain specification. If it isn't, it can't be used. It's as simple as that. Things like their suits, boots, gloves, and helmets are all bespoke to the individual rider to make sure they fit well, and in the event of a crash, they don't move around. This helps them offer maximum protection in the unfortunate event of a crash. If you want to keep up with all things MotoGP and bike racing in general, then make sure to subscribe. I've got lots of things planned, including live watch-along streams, more tech breakdowns, and so much more. And if there's a video you want to see me make in the future, then again, let me know in the comments below. Okay, back to the video. So we've gone through the bikes, tyres, electronics, safety equipment, but what actually happens on a race weekend? Well, every race weekend consists of practice, qualifying, and the race, or races. And I'm going to break the entire weekend for you down right now. Every weekend starts with practice. Practice is needed to allow the rider to get accustomed to the track, the bike, the conditions, everything. And if a rider misses out on practice with an injury or bike issues, they're going to be at a massive disadvantage throughout the rest of the weekend. So what does practice look like? Well, on Friday, you have 2 practice sessions. You have free practice 1 in the morning, which is a 45-minute open practice session. There's nothing on the line here. It's simply to allow teams to dial in the setup and to make sure that everything is working and that the rider is comfortable. Then in the afternoon, you have a 60-minute timed practice session. And this session decides the qualifying session that the riders will be in. That's going to make sense in a few moments, so stay with me. Once the 60-minute practice session finishes on Friday afternoon, that's it. It's then on to Saturday. So on to Saturday, and specifically qualifying. Remember how I just said that 60-minute practice session decides the qualifying group that the riders are going to be in? Well, it's because there's 2 qualifying sessions, aptly named Q1 and Q2. The top 10 fastest riders from that 60-minute time practice session yesterday automatically get put into Q2. Anyone outside of the top 10 gets put into Q1. For Q1, the riders are fighting for P13 and below on the grid for the race. But wait, you may be asking, why are they only fighting for P13 and below when only 10 riders go into Q2? Well, that's because the top 2 riders in Q1 get automatically moved into Q2 to give them another chance to fight for a higher grid position. After Q1's finished, you have Q2, and then once Q2 is finished, you have the starting grid for both races. And that moves us on to the sprint race, the first race in the weekend, and that's held on Saturday afternoon. The way the sprint race works is like this. It's half the distance of the main feature race on Sunday, and it's also only worth half the points, and only the top 9 riders score points. These range from 12 points for first down to 1 point for ninth. Once the sprint race is finished, that's it for Saturday. On to Sunday, and this is the main event, the feature race. Riders have another warm-up practice session before the race itself. Once warm-up's done, they'll get ready for the race. Qualifying from Saturday decides the starting order for the feature race as well, and the main race is full distance and offers full point, which is 25 points for first, all the way down to 1 point for 15th. If at any point during or before the race the heavens decide to open, riders are able to switch to a spare bike which will be set up for the wet. Teams also have the option to use wildcard entries for certain races. The wildcard system is relatively straightforward. A team uses a wildcard entry to allow another rider onto the grid with the rest of the field. This increases their testing time with the bike, allowing them to increase development, and more track time is always beneficial. That's why on occasion you might see additional riders being put on the grid. So you've got all of this info now, and you must be thinking to yourself, it can't be cheap. Well, you'd be right, it isn't. In fact, you'd be staggered to know how much it costs to run a MotoGP team. So let's dive in. MotoGP teams don't have a budget as such within regulations. They can spend what they like, and the only limiting factor is the budget of the team itself. While this might seem a little bit unfair, that some teams are able to spend more than others, MotoGP has a clever system to help with this, which I'm going to go through in a second. But there's no limit on anything like salaries, bike development, bike costs. It's all pretty much pay what you want. And if you want the best riders with the best bikes, you need to shell out a lot of money. While it's quite hard to actually find a definitive budget, I've managed to gather some figures from a couple of different sources, mainly for the bike costs and the entire team costs. Let's start with the bike cost first. To make sure you get a semi-competitive bike on the grid, you're looking at around $2 million per rider per season. And that's on the basis you don't throw it up the track every single session. The more you crash, the more it'll cost the team. And when you combine everything together, you're looking upwards of a staggering $30 million a season. Now, this number came from the KTM CEO Stefan Pierer in an interview. But what's that clever little system that MotoGP has to help with certain teams? Well, they're called concessions. And MotoGP now has a revised concession system for this year. What this does is provide certain manufacturers with additional benefits. Based on their performance or lack of performance, each manufacturer is put into a group. The groups are A, B, C, or D. Based on the previous seasons, Ducati is category A, KTM and Aprilia are category B, and Honda and Yamaha are category D. The higher the category, the less perks they have over the season. This limits them in things like testing, the number of engine changes, wildcard entries, and a few other things. The aim of these concessions is to help bring teams and manufacturers closer together for better racing. With Honda and Yamaha struggling the past few years, this should allow them to get back up to the pointy end of the field. So there we are, you're now a pro at MotoGP. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, to keep up to date on all things MotoGP and racing related. Thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.